On the outside, Oleg Kalugin looked like the perfect product of the Soviet security state. He was born in Leningrad in 1934, the son and the man who served in the NKVD, the feared predecessor of the KGB. He grew up in a city haunted by siege and famine, in a country that taught children to see the world through the lens of class struggle and secret enemies. As a young man, he entered Leningrad State University and was quietly recruited into the KGB's first chief directorate, the elite foreign intelligence branch. For decades, he would serve the Soviet Union as a spy, a handler, and eventually a general in charge of some of the KGB's most sensitive operations abroad. To American intelligence, Kalugin would later become something very different, a living blueprint of how the KGB really worked, and a rare general willing to admit, in public, that Moscow had used poisons, assassinations, and covert retaliations as tools of statecraft. And in his story, you can see how Soviet officers were forced to reckon with a West whose technological and informational edge became harder and harder to ignore. As a young recruit in the 1950s and early 1960s, Kalugin was sent abroad under the kind of legitimate cover that the KGB favored for some of its officers. In one of his most important early postings, he went to New York as a correspondent for Radio Moscow. On paper, he was a journalist, filing reports back to the Soviet domestic audience. In reality, he was an intelligence officer, using his position to meet contacts, collect information, and help manage the KGB's network in the United States. Those years shaped his understanding of America. He saw a society that the Soviet press portrayed as decaying and racist, yet one that was also dynamic, technologically advanced, and surprisingly resilient. He watched American media, universities, and politics up close, and he began to appreciate both the openness and the vulnerabilities of a system that did not depend on secret police to keep order. He also saw the reach of American intelligence and law enforcement, and how U.S. technical capabilities, from communication security to surveillance, forced the KGB to work harder just to stay in the game. By the early 1970s, Kalugin had risen to become chief of KGB operations in the United States for active measures, the political and influence side of foreign intelligence. His job was to run and coordinate campaigns of disinformation, propaganda, and political penetration aimed at weakening the U.S. from within. Under his direction, KGB officers and agents tried to infiltrate political groups, shape media narratives, support sympathetic activists, and feed forged or slanted material into the American information stream. The goal was not just to steal secrets, but to change the environment in which American decisions were made. He later described these efforts as a kind of psychological warfare designed to deepen racial tensions, widen ideological divides, and erode trust in American institutions. Yet, even as he worked to manipulate U.S. politics, he could not help noticing how difficult it was for the KGB to keep pace with American technology. The U.S. intelligence community was building global signals intelligence networks, pioneering satellite reconnaissance, and developing analytical techniques that made the Soviet focus on human penetration look increasingly old-fashioned and vulnerable. By the early 1970s, Kalugin had risen to become chief of KGB operations in the United States for Foreign Counterintelligence Directorate, the K Directorate of the first chief directorate. In that position, he was responsible for protecting Soviet operations abroad from Western penetration, detecting double agents, and running offensive counterintelligence missions against U.S. and allied services. If someone leaked from within, or if the CIA, FBI, or MI6 got too close to a KGB network, it was his department's problem. It was during this period that his name became associated with one of the most notorious political assassinations of the Cold War, the killing of Bulgarian dissident writer Georgy Markov in London in 1978. Georgy Markov had been a successful writer in communist Bulgaria before breaking with the regime and emigrating to the West. From London, he used broadcasts on the BBC and Radio Free Europe to criticize Todor Zhivkov's government and expose corruption and repression in Sofia. His words, carried by Western transmitters and radios into homes across Bulgaria, infuriated the leadership. By 1978, Zhivkov wanted him silenced. According to Kalugin's later accounts, Todor Zhivkov appealed to Moscow for help. Vladimir Krichkov, then a senior KGB official and later head of the service, conveyed the request to KGB chief Yuri Andropov. The KGB agreed to assist the Bulgarians. In Kalugin's telling, Andropov tasked him with organizing the technical side of the operation. Kalugin says he arranged to send KGB specialists to Sofia, bringing with them specially designed weapons, including a modified umbrella capable of firing a tiny pellet filled with a deadly toxin. On September 11, 1978, Georgy Markov was walking near London's Waterloo Bridge or waiting at a bus stop when he felt a sharp sting in the back of his thigh. He turned and saw a man picking up a dropped umbrella, who quickly apologized in an accent and walked away. Within hours, Markov developed a high fever and severe symptoms. He died a few days later. At autopsy, doctors found a tiny, drilled metal pellet embedded in his leg. Chemical analysis later indicated the presence of ricin, a highly toxic plant-derived poison. The case became famous as the Umbrella Murder, a symbol of Cold War espionage and the KGB's willingness to use science and stealth to eliminate dissidents abroad. For many years, Sofia and Moscow denied involvement. In 1990, as communism crumbled, Bulgarian officials admitted that the Markov assassination had been ordered by Zhivkov. By then, Kalugin was already talking to the press. In interviews with Bulgarian television and Western media, he described how the Bulgarians had requested KGB help and how KGB technicians had provided the Bulgarians with the special devices, including the umbrella weapon and micropellets. He talked about the existence of a KGB laboratory devoted to developing poisons and exotic weapons for use against enemies of the state. He said that the Markov operation was seen inside the KGB as a success and that he had been decorated for his role. At the same time, when British police questioned him in London in the early 1990s, Kalugin pushed back against specific quotes. An article in The Independent had reported that Andropov told him, "Kalugin, you take care of this," explicitly handing him the Markov case. Kalugin denied that wording and threatened legal action, claiming that while he knew the KGB had helped Bulgaria and had overseen technical support, he had not personally directed the assassins on the street. This mix of admission and denial added to his reputation as a man who was willing to expose the system, but careful to shield himself from legal consequences. Beyond the Markov case, Kalugin's memoirs and interviews contained other shocking assertions about KGB operations. In his 1994 book, The First Directorate, My 32 Years in Intelligence and Espionage Against the West, he wrote that Sean Burke, the man who had helped Soviet mole George Blake escape from a British prison in 1966, later died, in his view, from KGB-ordered poisoning when he became an embarrassment. He claimed that the KGB had virtually controlled the Russian Orthodox Church, using kompromat, compromising files, including sexual blackmail, to ensure that bishops and priests followed political instructions. He talked about a special KGB lab, sometimes referred to as the Camera or Laboratory X, whose scientists developed toxins and gadgets designed to kill, incapacitate, or terrorize targets without leaving obvious traces. Taken together, these revelations matched a broader pattern that Western services had pieced together from other defectors and investigations, a KGB that combined old-world ruthlessness with modern science, using chemistry and engineering to create tools of assassination and sabotage, even as it struggled to keep up with Western advances in fields like signals intelligence and high-technology reconnaissance. For an American audience, it is important to see how this looked from inside the KGB. As head of foreign counterintelligence, Kalugin was tasked not just with hunting Western spies, but with defending Soviet operations against a technologically superior adversary. He knew that American satellites could photograph bases, missile fields, and even individual aircraft. He knew that NSA and its partners were vacuuming up communications around the globe, straining to decrypt and analyze Soviet traffic. He watched as the United States rolled out more secure radios, modern encryption, and layered counterintelligence measures that made it harder for the KGB to insert agents or tap into Western systems without being detected. In that environment, the KGB leaned heavily on what it did know: human networks, disinformation, and terror. It could cultivate agents in Western governments and institutions. It could build secret labs to produce poisons and disguised weapons. It could direct allied services like Bulgaria's and others to carry out hits against inconvenient exiles. But it could not match the West's capacity to track, reconstruct, and eventually expose those operations through forensics, signals intelligence, and the accumulation of evidence over time. By the late 1970s and early 1980s, Kalugin's relationship with the KGB leadership was souring. Inside the organization, he became increasingly vocal about what he saw as its corruption and misdirection. He criticized the way the KGB protected high-level officials who abused power, while cracking down harshly on ordinary citizens and dissidents. He argued that the service had lost sight of genuine security threats and become a tool for the party's internal political battles. These internal criticisms did not sit well with his superiors. In 1980, he was demoted from his prestigious post in foreign counterintelligence and sent back to Leningrad as deputy chief of the city's KGB branch. It was still a senior job, but clearly a step down for someone once seen as a rising star. Even there, he continued to speak out, giving interviews to local media that touched on issues of corruption and the misuses of state security. In 1987, he was transferred to a security position at the Soviet Academy of Sciences, and in 1988 to the Ministry of the Electronics Industry, posts far from the core of KGB power. On February 26, 1990, he was forced into retirement. Officially, his long career in the KGB was over. Unofficially, he was about to become one of its most visible internal critics. When the August 1991 coup attempt against Mikhail Gorbachev unfolded, Kalugin sided with Boris Yeltsin and the forces opposing the hardliners. He publicly supported the dismantling of the Soviet security apparatus in its old form. After the coup's failure, he served briefly as an unpaid advisor to Vadim Bakatin, the last KGB chairman, who tried, with limited success, to reform and break up the organization. During this period, Kalugin gave more and more interviews, both inside Russia and abroad, describing what he had seen in his decades of service. He spoke about the KGB's domestic repression, about its sway over institutions like the Orthodox Church, and about its role in foreign assassinations and sabotage. He argued that any new Russian intelligence service should be stripped of political police functions and forbidden from running assassination labs and similar programs. In other words, he now called for the abolition of the very capabilities he had once helped to build and use. As Russia moved through the chaotic 1990s, Kalugin's position became increasingly precarious. In Moscow, many former colleagues and new power brokers saw him as a traitor, or at least as an embarrassment. He began spending more time in the West, giving lectures at universities, appearing in documentaries, and writing his memoirs for an English-speaking audience. He eventually settled in the United States in the mid-1990s. In 2002, a Moscow court convicted Oleg Kalugin in absentia of treason, stripping him of his rank of Major General and revoking his Soviet decorations. The charges centered on his public disclosures about KGB operations and his cooperation with Western media and institutions. For the Russian state, he had crossed a red line. For Western audiences, he had become one of the most prominent former KGB generals willing to talk. On August 4, 2003, Oleg Kalugin became a citizen of the United States. The man who once oversaw efforts to manipulate and undermine America now took an oath of allegiance to it. He continued to lecture and comment on Russian intelligence, often criticizing the resurgence of KGB-style practices in the post-Soviet era. His story is not simple. He was, undoubtedly, part of a machine that ran covert operations, including lethal ones, against dissidents and Western targets. He later helped expose that machine, confirming what many in the West had long suspected, that the KGB maintained poison labs, used disguised weapons, orchestrated assassinations like the Markov case, and systematically tried to warp Western politics through active measures. He also tried at times to distance himself from specific acts when legal or reputational risk loomed. He is, as many analysts put it, a problematic but indispensable witness. For American audiences, one key thread runs through his experience: the contrast between the KGB's reliance on fear, secrecy, and targeted violence, and the West's growing reliance on technology, open information, and institutional resilience. Kalugin spent his career trying to outmaneuver a country that could combine satellites, secure systems, forensic science, and archival work. Decades after the Markov murder, British investigators could match a tiny pellet and traces of ricin to KGB methods. Years after Soviet influence campaigns, American and European researchers could reconstruct them using declassified documents, defector testimony, and technical records. When he finally chose to speak, he was stepping into a world where his admissions could be checked and cross-checked against a mountain of data the KGB never fully controlled. In the end, Oleg Kalugin's journey from Leningrad schoolboy to KGB general to American citizen tells us much about the systems he served and then opposed, as it does about him personally. It shows a Soviet security apparatus that prided itself on its ruthlessness and ingenuity, yet felt constantly pressed by the technological and informational superiority of its adversary. It shows an American-led West that, for all its flaws, built mechanisms of intelligence, law, and public inquiry capable of uncovering, understanding, and ultimately outlasting the secret wars waged against it. For a long time, the KGB believed that its greatest strength was the silence of its officers and the darkness of its files. Kalugin is one of the people who proved that assumption wrong. When a general who once ran foreign counterintelligence begins to talk about umbrella guns, poison pellets, and laboratories hidden in Soviet buildings, the secrets are no longer safe. And when those stories meet the forensic science, satellite imagery, and archival work of American and Allied institutions, they become part of a much larger picture, one in which the West not only matches but surpasses its adversary in understanding how the secret game was really played.